Part 1 Westlake Fun Park. My name is Bastien, and I want to start this account the way I've started every retelling I've given to the small handful of people I've actually trusted with it since. By telling you that I did not believe in anything supernatural before the night of September the 14th, and that I have not been able to comfortably disbelieve in it since. I was a location scout for a mid-budget film production company at the time, the kind of job that sends you crawling through property records and half-forgotten industrial sites looking for exactly the right decayed backdrop for a director's vision. And it was that job, more than any morbid curiosity of my own, that first brought me and 4 colleagues to the gates of Westlake Fun Park on a warm, overcast Thursday evening with permits, a rented generator, and absolutely no idea what we were actually walking into. Westlake had operated for almost 40 years on the shore of a lake that had, by the time of our visit, been reduced by decades of drought and diversion to a thin, muddy remnant of the recreational destination it must once have been. The park closed in the mid-1990s following what every local account described only as the incident, a phrase so consistently vague across every source I found, from newspaper archives to a handful of nostalgic fan forums dedicated to preserving photographs of the park in its heyday, that I began to suspect, well before we ever set foot on the property, that the vagueness itself was doing considerable work to keep something specific from being said plainly. I did the kind of research any careful location scout does before committing a production's resources to an unfamiliar site: property records, prior access permissions, insurance considerations, the unglamorous administrative groundwork that rarely makes it into the finished footage but determines, more than anything else, whether a shoot proceeds smoothly or collapses into liability nightmares. Westlake's records were unusually thin for a property of its size and history, ownership having passed through a series of holding companies after the park's closure, each one apparently content to let the site sit fallow rather than either redeveloping it or formally decommissioning its remaining structures. I found this pattern faintly odd at the time, filed it away as simply another example of the kind of bureaucratic inertia that swallows abandoned properties everywhere, and did not think much more of it until considerably later. I want to introduce my colleagues properly because I think, given everything that happened, they each deserve to be more than names in an incident report nobody outside a small circle has ever properly read. Solveig Algren handled our permits and local liaison work, sharp, practical, the one who'd actually gotten us legal access to a property most urbex channels only ever visited illegally, a skill that had saved our productions from at least 2 serious legal complications in the years I'd worked alongside her, and that made her in my mind the single most reliable member of any team she was part of. And Rutger Voss, I want to be honest that yes, I am aware how often the surname Voss seems to turn up in accounts like mine, and I have no explanation for that beyond coincidence, except to say that Rutger himself found it funny in the dark, self-deprecating way he found most things funny, right up until the night stopped being funny for any of us at all. Was our production assistant, 26, eager, along mostly to carry equipment and learn the trade from people who'd been doing it longer. He joined our team only 4 months earlier, still in the phase of a young career where every location, however grim its history, carried more excitement than dread, and I remember, driving out to Westlake that afternoon, how much his enthusiasm had lightened the mood in the van, joking about ghost stories in a way none of us would find nearly as easy by the time the sun came up again. We arrived at Westlake a little after 5 in the evening, planning a single overnight scouting session to document the park's remaining structures for a horror feature our studio was developing, and none of us, walking through that rusted, chain-locked front gate with bolt cutters Solveig had cleared with the property's current absentee owner, expected the evening to become anything other than a long, atmospheric, slightly eerie work session followed by an uneventful drive home the following morning. Part 2 The Carousel. Rutger, it was in that administrative building, going through water-damaged filing cabinets by flashlight, that we found the first genuinely unsettling piece of documentation, a maintenance log, the final entries dated just 3 days before the park's official closure date, describing, in increasingly clipped, anxious handwriting, a series of unexplained equipment malfunctions across multiple rides, all occurring after normal operating hours, all involving machinery that showed no mechanical fault whatsoever when inspected the following morning. I remember reading through those entries with Solveig, both of us slowly falling silent as the escalating pattern became impossible to dismiss as ordinary maintenance frustration. A Ferris wheel found rotating at dawn with no one at its controls, concession stand lights found illuminated on mornings after the building's power had been deliberately cut the night before, and running through nearly every entry, a recurring reference to someone named Marchetti, mentioned always with a specific, weary deference that suggested a supervisor rather than a peer, despite the park's public records, as far as Solvay could quickly determine, listing no manager or owner by that name at any point in its operating history. The very last entry, written by someone identified only by the initials TM, read, "Carousel ran itself again last night, full cycle lights and music both. Nobody in the building. I've stopped trying to explain it to Marchetti. I don't think I want to be the one standing here explaining it to whoever comes after him either." Part 3. The first night. We regrouped with Anouk and Django a little after 9, comparing notes over a small camp meal set up near our equipment van, and I want to be honest that the maintenance log, discussed openly among all 5 of us in the relative safety of that gathering, had already started working on our collective nerve in ways none of us fully admitted at the time. Django, ever practical, suggested the obvious explanation: old electrical systems, decades of neglected wiring, ordinary phantom activations that a frightened maintenance worker in an already understaffed, failing business might reasonably have dressed up in more dramatic language than the facts actually warranted. Anouk, more inclined toward romanticizing the location's atmosphere for our film's benefit, seemed almost pleased by the discovery, treating it as exactly the kind of colorful backstory that would help sell our director on the location's authentic dread. I don't think any of us in that moment actually believed we were in danger. That belief lasted until almost 11 that night, when Rutger, checking our equipment near the carousel pavilion for a final round of night photography, called the rest of us over in a voice tight enough that all 4 of us dropped what we were doing and ran. The carousel was turning. I want to describe this as precisely as I can, because I've replayed it so many times since that I trust this account more than almost any other memory I currently hold. It was not turning fast, not the frantic, uncanny motion horror fiction often reaches for. It was turning at exactly the slow, stately pace a functioning carousel turns at when properly, gently operating, its lights impossibly fully lit despite 40 years without power, its calliope music playing at a volume just loud enough to carry clearly across the midway, a cheerful, tinny melody that felt, given everything surrounding it, considerably more sinister than any discordant, broken version of the same tune could have managed. I remember the specific smell that reached us, standing at the pavilion's edge, fresh popcorn impossibly, cutting through the night air alongside the mustier scent of old wood and rust, a detail so incongruous, so aggressively, deliberately nostalgic, that it unsettled me more than almost any visual element of the scene. None of us approached it immediately. We stood at the edge of the pavilion, 5 adults with flashlights and cameras rendered momentarily useless by a sight none of our equipment could adequately capture the wrongness of, and I remember Solveig, our most grounded, practical member, saying in a voice that had lost every trace of her usual confidence, "There's no power running to this building. I checked the panel myself this afternoon. There's nothing here that could be doing this." Django was the one who finally moved, approaching the carousel's edge with his camera raised, documenting rather than confronting, the specific professional instinct of someone whose job had trained him to record first and process later. The carousel slowed as he approached, not stopping but slowing, the way a machine might slow when responding to an unseen hand adjusting its speed, and by the time he'd circled halfway around its perimeter, it had come to a complete, silent stop, lights extinguishing in sequence rather than all at once, the calliope music trailing off mid-phrase in a way that felt, disturbingly, like something choosing to stop rather than simply running out of whatever had been powering it. Part 4. What the horses remembered. We should have left that night. I want that stated plainly, the way I've stated it in every account like this I've ever given, because I think the honest acknowledgement of the mistake matters more than any tidier version of the story where caution simply wasn't available to us. We did not leave in part because our equipment van's ignition, when Rutger tried it out of an abundance of caution around midnight, produced nothing but a single dry click, no engine turnover at all, despite having run perfectly on the drive-in and showing no obvious mechanical fault Django could identify by flashlight. We made camp that night in the relative safety of the park's old administrative building, all 5 of us together rather than spread thin across the property, and I want to describe what happened over the following hours as carefully as I can, because I think the specific individual nature of what each of us experienced matters for understanding what Westlake actually was, or at least what I've come to believe it was after months of trying to make sense of it. Anouk woke first, a little after 1 in the morning, insisting she'd heard a child's laughter coming from the direction of the midway. Not frightened, not particularly disturbed at first, describing it more with the professional curiosity of someone who'd spent the whole evening hoping for exactly this kind of atmospheric detail to enrich her production notes. It was only when she described the laughter's specific quality, layered, she said, multiple children rather than one, overlapping in a way that felt less like several distinct voices and more like a single voice trying on several different pitches in quick succession, that the rest of us understood we weren't dealing with anything as simple as an echo or a trick of wind through old structures. She told me later, once we'd had time to properly compare notes, that she'd almost gone to investigate alone, drawn by the same professional curiosity that had made her push so hard for this location in the first place, and that only a sudden, inexplicable reluctance, a physical unwillingness, she said, that felt less like fear and more like her own body refusing an instruction her mind hadn't fully finished giving, had kept her rooted in place long enough for the rest of us to wake and gather around her. Django's experience, which he didn't share with the rest of us until considerably later that night, involved the carousel horses themselves. He described stepping back out toward the pavilion around 2 in the morning, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain even to himself, and finding the horses' glass eyes tracking his movement across the platform, each head turned, almost imperceptibly, to follow him as he circled the ride's perimeter, a detail so subtle, he said, that he genuinely couldn't be certain, watching it happen, whether he was witnessing something real or simply exhausted, and it was that specific uncertainty, more than any confident description of movement, that frightened me most, hearing him describe it later. He told me he'd counted the horses twice, certain the number had changed between his 2 passes around the platform, though he couldn't ultimately convince himself the discrepancy was anything more than his own miscounting in poor light, a doubt he said bothered him more than a confident sighting would have, because at least a confident sighting would have given him something solid to actually be afraid of. Solveig's encounter was the one that finally broke our collective resolve to simply wait out the night in place. She'd stepped outside the administrative building to try our satellite phone, the only communication equipment that hadn't inexplicably failed alongside our van's ignition, and found, standing at the edge of the midway, a figure in what she described as period-appropriate carnival attire from decades earlier, a man in a striped vest and a tall, old-fashioned hat, standing perfectly still, watching the building we were sheltered in with an attention that felt, she said, less like observation, and more like patient proprietary ownership, the specific stillness of someone confirming that everything currently on his property was exactly where it was supposed to be. She said the satellite phone, functioning perfectly seconds before she stepped outside, produced nothing but static the entire time the figure remained visible, and resumed normal function the instant she retreated back through the administrative building's door, a correlation too precise, she insisted, to attribute to simple coincidental equipment failure. Buried further back in the filing cabinet, beneath the maintenance logs, was a folder of old newspaper clippings the park's administration had apparently kept, chronicling its own history across 4 decades. And among them a brief, easily overlooked article from the park's opening season, describing its first ringmaster and public face, a man whose stage name the article gave only as Mr. Marchetti, the same name TM's final maintenance entry had referenced with such clipped, exhausted familiarity decades later. The article described Marchetti in the warm promotional language of an era eager to sell wholesome family entertainment, charismatic, beloved by children, a fixture of the park's daily operations for its entire opening decade, credited by name in several enthusiastic quotes from early visitors reproduced in the piece, one mother describing him as the kindest man you'll ever meet, the sort who remembers every child's name after a single visit. A second, much smaller clipping, dated years later and clearly less prominently placed in the original paper given its size, reported his death in what the brief item described only as an accident involving the park's carousel mechanism, with no further detail offered about circumstances, investigation, or aftermath. I remember Solveig reading that second clipping twice, aloud, as though repetition might somehow force additional detail to surface from between its sparse lines, before setting it down with a specific, controlled frustration that told me she'd reached the same dead end the rest of us had. We found a third clipping, tucked behind the first 2, that none of us had initially noticed, a brief editorial printed roughly a year after Marchetti's death, arguing in careful, measured language clearly designed to avoid any direct accusation, that the park's ownership ought to consider a formal memorial for their beloved ringmaster, whose spirit, the piece noted, In language I suspect the original author meant only figuratively. Seems by numerous staff accounts reluctant to fully leave the grounds he gave so much of his life to. I remember the specific chill of reading that phrase aloud to the group, understanding for the first time that whatever we were dealing with had apparently been at least partially publicly acknowledged by the park's own staff decades before any of us had ever heard the name Westlake at all, acknowledged, and then, judging by every subsequent record we could find, quietly buried beneath decades of ordinary operation rather than ever properly addressed. "I think he's still running it," Rucker said, and I remember how young his voice sounded saying it. How much I wish now that observation had been enough to make all of us leave immediately rather than continuing to sit with it, processing, discussing, doing exactly the kind of careful, rational analysis that felt in the moment like responsible caution and that I now understand in hindsight was simply more time we were giving something patient enough to have already waited decades for. "Company. What does it want?" Anouk asked, echoing, without any of us realizing the resonance at the time, almost exactly the same question I've heard asked in other accounts of other hauntings since, and I remember Solveig, our most practical member, giving an answer that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that night. "I think parks like this always wanted the same thing while they were running," she said. "Attendance. Return visitors. Somebody who keeps coming back. I think whatever's happening here isn't some grudge or vengeance story. I think it's just a park that never actually agreed to close, still doing the only job it ever knew how to do. And I think we walked in tonight looking exactly like its first customers in longer than any of us want to think about." I asked her, unable to fully keep the tremor out of my voice, what she thought that meant for us practically, whether there was some version of this night that ended with all five of us simply walking back out the way we'd walked in. She was quiet for a long moment, turning her flashlight slowly in her hands before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I think parks close for a reason, even the ones that don't want to admit it to themselves. Fire codes, insurance, maintenance costs that don't pencil out anymore. I think whatever's running this one now doesn't have to worry about any of that, which means it doesn't have any of the ordinary pressures that would eventually force a real park to actually let its last customers go home. I think the only version of tonight that ends well is the version where we get out before it decides we're worth keeping around as permanent attendance figures." Django, who'd been quiet through most of this exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the specific, grim practicality I'd come to rely on from him across years of working together. "Then we stop treating this like a scouting trip and start treating it like an evacuation," he said. "We move as a group, we don't split up for any reason, and we don't stop to document anything else, no matter how good the footage might look. Nobody's career needs this badly." Nobody argued with him. I remember that specifically because I think it was the first genuinely unified decision our group made all night, 5 professionals accustomed to independent judgment finally, fully deferring to the one voice among us willing to state plainly that survival now mattered more than any of the reasons we'd originally come. Part 6. The Midway. The lights came on across the entire park a little after 4 in the morning, not gradually, not building the way a normal power-up sequence might, but all at once, every bulb along the midway and every string of carnival lights simultaneously blazing to life, throwing the whole property into a garish, cheerful illumination that felt, given the hour and everything that had already happened, considerably more threatening than the darkness it replaced. The calliope music started again from the carousel, joined now by additional sound, a distant, tinny recording of a barker's voice, looping through what sounded like an old, warped announcement inviting guests to step right up. Step right up, the park was open, the park had always been open, the park would remain open for as long as there were guests still willing to enjoy it. I remember standing at the administrative building's window, watching that light spread across the property, and feeling something I can only describe as vertigo at the sheer, cheerful ordinariness of it. This was not, in that first moment, a frightening sight in any conventional sense. It looked, if anything, inviting, warm, exactly the kind of nostalgic glow our director had hoped to capture on camera. And I think that specific dissonance, the gap between how threatening the situation actually was and how welcoming it visually presented itself, was its own kind of horror, a reminder that whatever was orchestrating all of this understood with real sophistication exactly what kind of surface would be most effective at drawing people back in rather than driving them away. We made the decision, gathered in that office, to attempt reaching the front gate on foot, abandoning our disabled van entirely, on the theory that whatever was keeping us here seemed tied specifically to the property itself rather than to any mechanism we might disable or negotiate with directly. It was, in hindsight, both the correct decision and nowhere near sufficient on its own, because the walk to that gate, across a newly illuminated midway blazing with impossible light, turned out to be the most dangerous stretch of the entire night. The rides had all started running. Not just the carousel. The Ferris wheel we'd photographed as motionless and rusted hours earlier now turned steadily against the dark sky, its cars swinging gently, every one of them, as far as our flashlights could confirm, entirely empty. The roller coaster's decayed, rotted structure groaned and shuddered under weight it should never again have been able to bear, a distant, rattling clatter suggesting a train of cars moving somewhere along its length that none of us could actually see from the ground, though at one point, glancing up as we hurried past its base, I caught what might have been a fleeting impression of pale, upturned faces rushing past far overhead, gone before I could confirm I'd actually seen anything at all. Even the smaller attractions had joined in. A teacup ride spinning steadily nearby, a small child-sized train circling its track with an empty, ringing bell, a funhouse entrance whose distorted mirrors reflected our own flashlight beams back at impossible, elongated angles as we hurried past. And scattered across the midway itself at the edges of our vision, in the gaps between illuminated booths were figures, not many, not a crowd exactly but present, moving with the unhurried, aimless wandering of people genuinely enjoying an evening at a carnival, dressed, every one of them as far as I could make out, in clothing that belonged to decades before any of us had been born. I want to describe the specific horror of that wandering, unhurried quality, because I think it was more disturbing than outright aggression would have been. These were not creatures stalking us, not monsters lunging from the shadows, but something that looked, from any reasonable distance, exactly like ordinary park guests enjoying an ordinary evening, a horror built entirely out of context rather than appearance, the specific wrongness of recognizing that an evening's cheerful crowd had no business existing at all. I remember passing close enough to one figure, a woman in a long old-fashioned skirt standing near an ice cream stand, to hear her humming softly along with the calliope music, a small, private, contented sound that I found, more than any scream or growl could have managed, the single most frightening detail of that entire walk, evidence unmistakable and intimate, that whatever she was experienced her own presence there as entirely ordinary, entirely pleasant, an evening at the fair like any other evening at any other fair across however many decades she'd apparently been attending it. She stood at that booth's edge transfixed, and when Django moved to physically pull her away, the figure inside the booth's shadow reached out and closed small, pale fingers around her wrist with a grip that Django later described as impossibly strong for something with such a slight, childlike frame. We got her free, Django and Rutger together, hauling her bodily backward while Solveig and I kept our flashlights trained on the booth, watching the small figure's expression shift, in the space of a few seconds, from delighted recognition to something flatter and colder, an expression that had nothing childlike about it at all. I remember the specific horror of watching that transformation happen in real time, the same face somehow conveying within a handful of seconds, first genuine warmth and then something that looked disturbingly like patient, calculating disappointment, the expression of something that had expected an easier evening than the one it was currently getting. We ran the remaining distance toward the front gate as a group, or at least we tried to. The midway, which had seemed a straightforward, familiar stretch of ground during our earlier daylight walkthrough, now felt considerably longer and considerably less predictable, booths and attractions seeming to shift position slightly each time we lost sight of them, forcing us to double back twice when a turn that should have led toward the gate instead brought us circling back past the coaster's base. Rutger stayed close to the group throughout. I want to be clear about that, matching pace with the rest of us, calling out warnings when he spotted another wandering figure ahead of our path, doing everything a careful, responsible team member should have done in that situation. It was in the final stretch, cutting through a narrow gap between two shuttered concession stands that our earlier daylight map suggested was the most direct remaining route to the gate, that I lost sight of him. I want to be honest that I cannot tell you exactly when or exactly how. One moment he was there, close enough that I could hear his footsteps alongside my own, and the next emerging from that narrow gap into the open stretch before the fence line. There were 4 of us instead of 5, and none of us, comparing accounts afterward in the chaos of that final sprint, could identify a single specific moment where the separation had actually occurred. Solveig thought she remembered him falling slightly behind to help a nuke over a fallen section of fencing. Django thought he remembered Rutger calling out that he'd spotted a faster route and would meet us at the gate. Neither memory matched the other, and neither of us has ever been able to fully reconcile that discrepancy, which frightens me in its own quiet way, almost as much as anything more overtly supernatural from that entire night. We reached the gate with the fence's chain link still bearing the cut Solveig had made with her bolt cutters hours earlier, and I remember the specific desperate relief of actually getting through it, out onto the access road beyond, putting solid ordinary ground between ourselves and everything we were leaving behind. A relief that lasted only as long as it took the four of us to turn breathless and realize our count was short. The lights across the park went out behind us almost the instant the last of us cleared the fence line. Not gradually, the same abrupt, total transition that had brought them on hours earlier, and the silence that followed felt, after so many hours of calliope music and looping Barker recordings, almost unbearably loud in its own right. We were four when we reached the access road. I want that sentence to sit by itself the way it has sat by itself in my memory every day since, because I don't think softening it with additional context does justice to what it actually cost. Rutger was gone. None of us could say with any confidence exactly when, whether he'd been separated from the group in that final desperate sprint toward the gate, or whether something considerably more deliberate had happened in those chaotic final minutes that none of us, in our own panic, had actually witnessed clearly enough to describe. Django wanted to go back in immediately, and I understood that impulse completely, and I was the one along with Solveig who physically stopped him, both of us repeating over and over the same desperate, uncertain logic, that going back through that gate now with the park already dark again with no clear plan beyond raw panic, would almost certainly cost us a fifth person rather than recover the fourth. Part 8. The Investigation. We called for help the moment we reached cell signal, roughly a mile down the access road. And I want to be honest that the investigation that followed treated our account with almost exactly the skepticism I'd expect any account like this to receive from local authorities unfamiliar with the property's history. A search was conducted over the following days, turning up no trace of Rutger anywhere on the grounds, no evidence of forced entry beyond our own documented access point, nothing that could confirm or meaningfully investigate any detail beyond the bare, mundane fact of an adult male gone missing during an overnight location scout at an abandoned property. I sat through 3 separate interviews with investigators over the following 2 weeks, each one a careful exercise in deciding how much of the actual truth to include without triggering the kind of dismissal that would end the search prematurely. I described the carousel running with no power source, and watched the interviewing detective's expression shift into the specific, practiced neutrality officers reserve for statements they've already privately decided not to weight heavily. I described the figures on the midway, and watched that same detective write down possible intoxication or exhaustion-related perceptual disturbance, in handwriting angled just enough that I could read it upside down across the table. I stopped after that third interview, offering any further detail beyond the bare, defensible facts. That we'd become separated from our colleague during an evacuation from a property whose equipment had inexplicably failed, and that we had not seen him since. The park's current absentee owner, when contacted by investigators, apparently expressed considerable surprise that we'd been able to access the property at all, given that his own understanding of Westlake's legal status included a standing prohibition against any nighttime visits, a restriction his family had maintained, according to records investigators eventually shared with us, for over 2 decades, without ever publicly explaining why. Solveig, who'd handled our permits, later confirmed that the paperwork she'd secured had authorized only daytime access, a detail she insisted, with what I believe was genuine and devastated confusion, had somehow been misrepresented to her during the approval process, though by whom or through what specific error neither she nor anyone else has ever been able to determine. She showed me, weeks later, the original email chain approving our access, and I want to describe the specific chill of reading it myself, every message professionally worded, every timestamp accounted for, nothing that suggested any deliberate deception on anyone's part, and yet somehow, across that entire documented chain, the word daytime appeared not once, an absence Solveig herself hadn't noticed until she went back through it specifically looking for the restriction investigators had described to her. Anouk left the film industry entirely within 2 months of that night, and I don't blame her. Django still works with our production company, though he's told me plainly that he will not take another assignment involving an abandoned amusement park, regardless of budget or opportunity, for the rest of his career. Solveig and I still speak regularly, careful conversations that circle everything except the specific details of that night. The way people do when a shared trauma is too large and too strange to safely hold between two people at once. I've gone back to that access road once since, alone, unable to fully resist the same compulsion that has driven every narrator of every account like this I've ever encountered. The need to see the place again in daylight and confirm with my own eyes that whatever we experienced couldn't simply reassert itself in the safety of an ordinary afternoon. The fence had been repaired, the cut Solveig made now welded shut, a new, considerably more serious padlock hanging where the old chain had once been. I stood at that fence for a long time, looking through it at a park that looked, in full daylight, exactly as decayed and abandoned as our archival photographs had promised, motionless, silent, giving no indication at all of anything that might come alive again once the sun went down. I remember pressing my palm against the cold chain link, close enough to the property that I could make out, even from that distance, the carousel's pavilion roof rising above the surrounding structures, and feeling standing there in broad, ordinary daylight a specific unwelcome certainty that whatever occupied that property was, in some sense I couldn't fully articulate, aware of my presence at that fence line regardless of the hour. I don't know what happened to Rutger, and I don't know if I will ever know. I have written to his family, carefully, incompletely, offering what comfort I can without providing an account I don't believe they're prepared to actually hear in full. His mother called me once, several weeks after the search was officially suspended, asking gently whether I believed he might still be alive somewhere, and I told her the only honest thing I had left to offer, that I didn't know, that I hadn't stopped hoping, and that I would tell her immediately if I ever learned anything further, a promise I have kept, though I have had in the months since nothing further to actually tell her. I think about Solveig's theory more than almost anything else from that night, that Westlake never really closed, that it simply kept doing the only job it ever knew how to do, waiting patiently decade after decade, for the next group of visitors curious enough or foolish enough or simply unlucky enough to wander in through a gate that should have stayed locked. If you ever find yourself standing outside an abandoned amusement park, drawn by the specific melancholy beauty decay lends to a place built for children's laughter, and you feel that pull to see it up close, to document it, to understand what it must have been like in its prime, I am asking you on behalf of Rutger, and on behalf of whoever TM was, and on behalf of every name that might be quietly recorded somewhere in a ledger none of us have ever found, to resist that pull until the sun is fully up, and to be gone again well before it sets. Some parks are still open. They are simply very patient about which hours they choose to admit that.